Hey guys, we are going to be taking a look at a walkthrough of the concept application FRQ that I had originally signed to you guys last week for your Unit 9 FRQ. So this is an FRQ that is a concept application, and it deals with civil rights and civil liberties in particular, or at least it mentions it in a part of the FRQ. So that's why it was assigned for Unit 9. So here's the plan for this. The first thing that I'm going to do is walk through the question, and then I'm going to go through the rubric with you guys, okay? You will have received your FRQ back via email, and I am going to give you guys in your email your score as well as your text, and you will then revise your FRQ based on this video. Okay, so I am going to give you guys a chance to revise. I think with this barrier of remote learning, I think that's pretty important to kind of re-look at our work and make sure that we're understanding exactly what is expected of us for the AP test that's going to happen on May 11th. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is just kind of walk you through some of the key points for an FRQ, no matter what. First things first, remember your writing tips and answer the verb. So identify, describe, and explain are going to be the three big terms that you see. Those are indicating a different level of depth that you will have to answer in. Right? To identify something is a lot different than to explain something and to describe something. So, for example, if someone were to ask you to describe your favorite meal, you wouldn't just say Chipotle. Okay, what about Chipotle? Why is it your favorite meal? You simply identified. Okay, so that is what you need to think about when you're seeing these task verbs in your FRQ questions. Okay, so make sure that you are, if you're identifying, think about it like one sentence. You don't need to elaborate or explain anything. Describing, make sure you're providing some detail or characteristics on the topic. Bring in the scenario. You're going to hear me talk about this a lot in the video. Always try to relate it to the scenario that they're giving you in this concept application, so that way they can see that you can apply what you know about AP Gov to this new concept, to this new scenario that you've been given. I suggest your description should be like 1 to 2 sentences, and then explain is going to be your most in-depth answer. So I would probably prepare for an explain answer to be a paragraph. And a paragraph, like, I'm not talking massive, right? But 3 to 5 sentences, really to make sure that you provide enough detail, that you're defining all relevant terms, using the word because, elaborating, providing evidence, proving that you know your stuff and can relate it to what's in the scenario. Okay. Another tip, I know things are a little bit wonky this year, but make sure to pace yourself. With this particular FRQ, this will be FRQ number 2 on the test on May 11th, and you will have 15 minutes to write this test or write this FRQ. Okay, so from here on out, right, like I'm not with you, I can't time you, but from here on out, if you are given a concept application, it is crucial that you time yourself. Okay, on test day, if you're still typing, it's going to kick you out and it will not submit your answer. Okay, so make sure that you are timing yourself to get comfortable with this length of time. Heck, for your revision that you complete after watching this video, I suggest setting that timer for 15 minutes. Okay, so let's break down the concept application question. This question is going to feel very overwhelming at first, because what they're doing is giving you a brand new situation. They're going to call it an authentic scenario or an authentic situation that you have probably never heard of before. That's on purpose. They're doing that on purpose. It's not that I failed you and didn't give you the right stuff. They're doing that on purpose. Okay, usually these types of questions are going to involve the institutions of government, the political institutions, meaning Congress, the judicial branch, the executive branch, interest groups, things like that. Okay, and usually it'll involve some sort of conflict as well. Okay, so even if you don't understand anything, or you've never heard, I should say, anything in this scenario, if you are confident and you know your branches of government and their connections and how they relate to one another, you will ace this. Okay? So in class, right, Alliance Defending Freedom, I've never talked about that interest group. We've never talked about Pulpit Freedom Sunday. But there are key pieces in this scenario that you do know that will earn you all points and will get you a 100% on this FRQ. Okay, so let's break down the FRQ, talk about what it is, and then I'm going to show us the rubric and walk through it. So the question says, since 2008, the Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative Christian interest group, has promoted an annual event known as Pulpit Freedom Sunday. On this occasion, pastors are encouraged to challenge a provision of the tax law known as the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits political activity by certain nonprofit organizations, including religious organizations. While the Johnson Amendment does not restrict religious leaders from speaking out regarding social issues, it does prohibit them from contributing money to political campaigns or speaking out in favor of or against candidates running for political office. On Pulpit Freedom Sunday, as an act of civil disobedience, pastors and religious leaders preach openly about the moral qualifications of candidates seeking office. Okay, that is a lot of detail, and what your job is at first is to sort through those details and figure out what the questions are going to be asking, right? There is quite honestly quite a bit of unnecessary detail in there. Okay, so what stands out to me first, interest groups. Okay, we're talking about interest groups, these groups that have a particular focus that we know and we've talked about, lobby Congress to get what they want, right? We know how Congress can deal with them, how they deal with the judicial branch, right? We know all this stuff without even reading the questions yet. Okay, so you need to start thinking about what you know about that institution before we move into the questions. Okay, so our tasks for this question are one, or letter A, to describe an action that Congress could take to address the concerns of the interest group in the scenario. Okay, so it's not identify, it's describe. So you do have to provide some characteristics. I'm talking 1 to 2 sentences about for this one, and I'll show you kind of a good example and a not good example when we go through the rubric. Okay, so this here is talking about how does Congress, or how can Congress interact with interest groups when there is a conflict like the one we're seeing here, where the Alliance Defending Freedom is protesting civilly, right? It's civil disobedience, this Johnson Amendment, prohibiting certain nonprofits, including religious organizations, from speaking out and contributing money financially or to campaigns. Okay, so we're going to describe an action that Congress could take to address the concerns of the interest group. You need to now start thinking about, okay, I know what an interest group is and what it does and how it influences government. Congress. What does Congress do? You guys know this. We've done this. You are pros at this, right? What does Congress do? What is the main function of Congress? Okay. B, in the context of the scenario, explain how partisan divisions could prevent the action described in Part A. So ultimately, what this is saying is, based on the action that you say Congress can take, how might that be made more difficult based on partisan divisions? Okay, and obviously you'll need to go through and make sure you know what partisan divisions means and how that can impact politics. Okay, Part C now, again, is to explain why the Alliance Defending Freedom might argue that their constitutional rights are threatened by the Johnson Amendment. Okay, so ultimately, this question is also saying, explain how, in this scenario, this interest group might say that their rights and liberties are being threatened. Okay, now something else to note before we actually go through the rubric. You will see that it says in the context of the scenario, in the scenario, by the Johnson Amendment, which is a part of the scenario. You need to 100% of the time relate all of your answers back to this, whatever the scenario is. Okay, even if it feels silly, relate it back to what they have given you as or in the prompt. Okay, always make sure you are explaining yourselves in relation to what is in the scenario. Okay. Another thing, do you see how it says here how it could prevent the action described in Part A? That's giving you a clue about how they are awarding points. Okay, this is only a 3-point question, but it's very important that you pay attention to this, because if you are supposed to describe something that you talked about in Part A and you do not get Part A correct, you do not get the point for Part B. Okay, so in order to earn point B, you have to earn point A. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're going through the rubric. Okay, so I'm going to move my window up here and let's go through this rubric. Okay, so when we take a look at Part A, okay, we need to break down the question, I guess, a little bit more. First of all, you need to make sure that you understand what exactly the interest group is upset about. Right? We know that this is talking about a conflict between interest groups and Congress, but what is the conflict itself, right? So we know that this interest group is encouraging or being encouraged, to challenge a provision of the Johnson Amendment that prohibits political activity by certain nonprofit organizations, including religious organizations. That is what the Johnson Amendment is, and this is what they are protesting, okay? And that is going to be very important as you go through this, okay? So for letter A, point A, we need to describe an action that Congress could take to address the concerns of the interest group in the scenario. Okay, now always relate it back to the scenario, as I've said multiple times, and you do need to describe. So you cannot just say an action of Congress and be done. You have to describe that action. Give me 1 to 2 sentences, give me some detail. Okay, now this is asking you basically, what does Congress do? Okay, hopefully in your original writing, Congress could pass a law. Right? We've really talked about the number one function of Congress is to make laws. Okay, so when I would write my answer, what I would be talking about is one action that Congress could take to address the concerns of the interest group. And you know what? I would even throw in there Alliance Defending Freedom, right, to show that you are connecting it to pieces of the scenario, would be to pass a law that would reverse the Johnson Amendment. Okay, now this sentence here is what earns you the point. If you were to leave it at Congress would be to pass a law, that is not your point, because you have now just identified, you have not described what that action is. Okay, so you need to make sure that you are addressing the concern of the interest group, which we talked about is this provision of the Johnson Amendment. Do you see how it's asking you to kind of go back into the scenario and apply what you know? Okay, so other examples that would also earn you the point would be things like one action that Congress could take to address the concerns of the interest group would be to pass a law that would allow religious organizations to participate more directly in politics. Again, it goes beyond just passing a law, and it's also describing the concern of the interest group, because according to this Johnson Amendment, they're prohibited from political activity, right? They can speak out regarding social issues, but they can't contribute financially or speak out in favor of or against a candidate, right? So by passing a law that would allow them to participate more directly, that is allowing them or addressing their concerns. Okay. Another thing that would earn the point, this one is a little bit more iffy, but this earned a point on the 2018 exam. Congress could pass a law that addresses the concerns of the interest group that relates to their goal or policy agenda. Now, if you left it at that, again, that's just that's no point because you're just identifying. But if you were to add on such as religion in this case, that's what earns you the point, because you have now described for the grader that the concern of the Alliance Defending Freedom is religion. You've described the goal of that interest group. Okay. All right. So now that we've identified an action of Congress, and hopefully you guys earned your point for point A, now for part B, we have to explain how partisan divisions could prevent this action that we described before in the context of the scenario, right? So we know that our action described in part A is going to be that Congress can pass a law that would reverse the Johnson Amendment. Let's go with that one, okay? Now we need to explain, we need to elaborate, give examples, provide evidence to explain how partisan divisions could prevent the action described in part A. And this is where vocab comes in. Do you know what partisan divisions are? Okay, because if they're using a key term, your butt better be defining that key term in your paragraph. Okay, do not assume that the reader knows what you're talking about. You need to prove it to them. Okay, so partisan divisions would be how I would start your paragraph or your answer off, okay? You need to demonstrate that you know what partisan divisions are within the context of the scenario, okay? So we know from talking in class that partisan divisions are divides in ideology between conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, right? And then we've talked about the gridlock or the divided government that can result in or from, I should say, these divisions and how that impacts policymaking, okay? So an example would be here, one way that partisan divisions could prevent Congress from, so you start out in a complete sentence, and then I insert my answer from letter A, from passing a law that reverses the Johnson Amendment would be, okay? And this is now where I'm going to explain, okay? I'm going to define partisan divisions. I'm going to say that partisan divisions make it more difficult to pass a law because different parties adhere to different political ideological points of view. Okay? You've ultimately told the reader what partisan divisions are. Okay? Now, I'm going to give an example from the scenario. For example, reversing the Johnson Amendment is a more conservative or Republican plan. Congress today is more divided between the two parties. Democratic or more liberal lawmakers will be more likely to not agree with this provision because it can be seen as giving religious groups too much power and weakening the separation of church and state. Okay, so there I've done a couple of things. I've not only connected it to my answer from A, okay, I've defined what partisan divisions are, and I've provided an example from the scenario that explains why partisan divisions would make this more difficult. Okay, now the final thing that I'm going to do is put in a sentence like this. This would make passing a provision or law I should add that, or a law, very difficult between the two chambers of Congress. This sentence right here is very important. This is called closing the loop. Okay. And I know it sounds kind of redundant, right? It's like, okay, I've just made my point here. You need to be very explicit when you are writing. Make sure that you close the loop and try to restate what you're talking about that addresses the prompt, right? Because the point is, how can partisan divisions prevent the action? It would make it or make passing a provision very difficult. Okay, so you've essentially restated the prompt here. Okay, another route that you could go if you didn't rely on ideology so much, right? When we've talked about partisan politics, we've also talked about divided government. You could answer in this way as well. One way that partisan divisions could prevent Congress from passing a law that reverses the Johnson Amendment would be that if Congress and the president are from different political parties, the president might threaten to veto the legislation. This is known as divided government, which often creates gridlock in political action. And you know what? I would even add that sentence here as well. This would make passing a provision or law very difficult between the two chambers of Congress and the president. Again, closing that loop between what they're asking you and your explanation. Okay. All right. So then finally we have point C, which is to explain, again, describing, elaborating, providing evidence from the scenario as to why the Alliance Defending Freedom might argue that their constitutional rights are threatened by the Johnson Amendment. So with this, you need to be thinking about rights and liberties, the Bill of Rights. Okay, that is what it's trying to get you to think about. Okay, so if we go back up to the scenario, there are a couple of ways you might take this. I think one is easier than the other. So that's what we're going to talk about. If you have particular questions on the other one, let me know. But this is a conservative Christian interest group. So one, your brain should be going to freedom of religion. Okay. Now, that's actually not the one I think is the easiest. I think the second one, since the Johnson Amendment prevents religious organizations from speaking out in favor of a candidate or against a candidate and contributing to campaigns for them, I think that's going to be more free speech. Okay, I think you're going to have a better time making the argument for freedom of speech. Okay, and that's what it's talking about with constitutional rights. So when you start your answer, again, always use a complete sentence. The Alliance Defending Freedom might argue that their First Amendment rights are being violated. So I would first broadly outline what amendment, what provision, what clause, right? That's very broad. Then, since it says explain, you can go into more detail and relate it back to the scenario, right? We know that speech and religion are tied to the First Amendment of the Constitution, okay? So then an answer would look like this. The Johnson Amendment prohibits religious leaders or organizations from publicly supporting a candidate, therefore limiting their free speech. Again, I've just explained how it relates to the First Amendment based on the scenario, what the Johnson Amendment does or prevents these groups from doing. Now, you can also include explanations to prove what you know and tie other course content to the scenario. So a rockstar answer would also include something like this. Also, the government is restricted from limiting speech unless there is a clear and present danger created by that speech, which is a precedent established by the court case Schenck v. U.S. In the case of the Johnson Amendment, there is no clear and present danger from the actions of the religious leaders and organizations. Okay, so what I've done there is I've input a court case that is a required court case to again strengthen the use of it. Now, if you're going to do this, you have to define the court case, the document, whatever term you're going to use, make sure to do that. But that is a good strategy to use, okay? Now, something else that I would add is I'm just noticing, I didn't really close the loop here too much. So it says, in the case of the Johnson Amendment, there is no clear and present danger from the actions of the religious leaders and organizations, thus limiting or thus representing a violation of the interest group's First Amendment right to free speech. Right? Closing the loop, bringing it all together, making a nice little bow on your response. Okay? So that kind of walks us through this Unit 9 FRQ. We are going to be practicing a lot more of these FRQs. Hopefully you found this helpful. I will be asking for feedback in the coming days, so make sure you provide that. But here is your task. I will be providing you with your FRQ and your original score once I see that you have completed and watched this video on Edpuzzle in full. You will receive an email from me, okay? So after you watch this video entirely and answer the question embedded in the video, I will send you an email with your FRQ and your score, how I scored it. You will then rewrite your FRQ, okay, and that can be handwritten, it can be typed, and you will then upload it to Google Classroom for Monday, April 20th, okay? And I will give you credit back on your FRQ, okay? So hopefully you feel a little bit better about the concept application FRQ. Please let me know if you guys have any questions, and I will talk to you guys soon. See you later.